Hello everyone. I hope you're settling in comfortably, because today we're going to explore a part of history that few ever talk about. A world behind the front lines, hidden from the headlines and the glory of battles. I want to take you inside the military hospitals of World War II. Places where life and death danced together in ways most people could never imagine. But before we dive in, I'm curious. Where are you listening from? And what time is it right now? It's always fascinating to know the corners of the world where these stories reach. Isn't it? My name is Thomas Keller, though that was just what they called me back then. A young medic, barely 22, arriving at a sprawling military hospital somewhere deep behind the front lines. The moment I stepped through those gates, the world I thought I knew shattered into pieces of blood, bandages, and quiet, desperate whispers. The hospital wasn't just a place for healing. It was a universe in itself, filled with unseen battles, secrets, and stories no one dared write down. The first thing that hit me was the smell, a combination of antiseptic, disinfectant, and the sharp, metallic tang of blood that lingered in the air. Every breath reminded me that this was no ordinary place. And then there were the sounds. The low murmur of nurses moving through hallways, the occasional scream from a ward that had been transformed into chaos by new arrivals, the clanging of metal as stretchers were wheeled in. Night and day blended together. Time felt slippery. A shift could last forever, and yet pass in the blink of an eye. I remember my first night vividly. I was assigned to the surgical ward, where men who had survived the battlefield but lost pieces of themselves, limbs, vision, sometimes even hope, were brought in. And the doctors moved like a silent storm, calm on the surface but rushing endlessly underneath. One moment a soldier would be screaming, crying out in pain, and the next, he would be asleep under the knife, and all around, the staff worked in a rhythm only they seemed to understand. But it wasn't just the visible injuries that caught my attention. I quickly learned there were patients who seemed different, hidden in corners or behind locked doors, their faces pale, eyes distant, their stories whispered among the staff but never recorded officially. Some said they were special cases, others hinted at things that seemed impossible. Injuries from secret experiments, rare illnesses, even psychological wounds too deep to name. The rumors swirled, and I, eager to understand my new world, listened intently. I remember watching one particular operation. The patient had been carried in, unconscious, and the head surgeon was working with steady hands, his brow furrowed. Yet there was something in his eyes, a flicker of fear or perhaps worry, that made my stomach tighten. Around us, nurses passed instruments silently, their movements precise, rehearsed, as though they were part of a performance that must never falter. The room was filled with tension so thick you could almost touch it. And yet, there was also a strange beauty in it, a testament to the human body's fragility and resilience intertwined. Outside the surgical wards, life in the hospital moved in patterns that seemed chaotic yet strangely orderly. Patients formed bonds in ways that doctors and nurses never noticed. Stories were shared in hushed tones, often about home, sometimes about the battles they had fought, sometimes about things they couldn't quite name. Some patients laughed in the middle of pain, others cried silently, and I learned quickly that the quietest ones often carried the heaviest burdens. Even as a newcomer, I could sense the invisible rules that governed the hospital. There were hierarchies and loyalties, unspoken codes about which patients were to be treated openly and which remained a secret. I found myself asking questions I wasn't supposed to. Why was a particular ward always locked at night? Why did some soldiers disappear after certain treatments, never to be seen again? Each answer was always partial, a fragment of truth that only deepened the mystery. And then there were the nights, when the corridors fell silent, except for the occasional distant cry or the scuff of a boot against the floor. The hospital seemed alive in another way. Shadows stretched long along the walls, and every creak of a door or rustle of a sheet felt amplified. Nurses would whisper about patients who were supposed to be asleep, about strange noises that didn't belong to anyone living. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was exhaustion playing tricks. Yet deep down I knew there were things in that place I would never fully understand. Even now, when I think back, I remember the first time I truly understood that a military hospital wasn't just a place of healing. It was a mirror of the war itself. Behind the doors, life and death collided in private battles as intense and unforgiving as any fought on the front lines. And as I walked those hallways, carrying bandages, needles, and my own unspoken fears, I realized I was entering a world where the rules of normal life didn't apply, where humanity was tested every hour, and where the stories hidden in the shadows were sometimes more haunting than the ones told in the open. So, here I was, Thomas Keller, a young medic at the edge of everything I thought I knew, staring into the heart of a machine designed to save lives, yet filled with mysteries, secrets, and tales that had never been told. And little did I know, the deeper I went, the stranger and darker this world would become, pulling me into a web of human courage, moral conflict, and secrets that stretched beyond the hospital walls. The first night shift hit me like a wave I wasn't prepared for. The sun had already disappeared hours ago, leaving the hospital cloaked in shadows and the occasional flickering of electric lamps that barely lit the long corridors. The air was heavier at night, as if it carried the weight of all the pain, fear, and exhaustion that had accumulated over months. I had been told by senior medics that night shifts were different, that the hospital revealed a side that was hidden during the day, and now I was about to learn exactly what that meant. The surgical ward was chaotic, yet methodical in a way that only experienced doctors seemed to understand. A soldier had been brought in barely conscious, his uniform soaked with blood, a jagged gash running across his shoulder. The team moved like clockwork, but there was tension in the air, a tension I could feel pressing against my chest. Every instrument passed, every word spoken, had a weight to it. A single mistake could cost a life. And in that moment, I realized that fear was as much a part of the job as skill or knowledge. I was handed a tray of instruments for the first time, my hands trembling slightly. One of the nurses noticed and gave me a quick nod, an unspoken reassurance that I wasn't expected to be perfect yet. But as I reached for the first scalpel, a sudden scream from the next ward froze me in place. The sound was guttural, desperate, and strangely human in its rawness, a cry that seemed to echo through every corner of the building. I swallowed hard, reminding myself that this was reality, that death and pain were part of the landscape I had chosen to enter. As the night progressed, more patients arrived. Stretchers clattered down the hallways, each one carrying a story of violence, survival, and unimaginable suffering. I watched as medics moved with a kind of brutal grace, stabilizing bodies, tending wounds, and occasionally whispering comforting words that probably didn't reach the consciousness of those in agony. Yet even in this storm of urgency, there were small moments that caught me off guard. A soldier holding another's hand, a nurse whispering encouragement, a fleeting smile from someone who had seen too much to feel joy but still clung to it. It wasn't just the visible injuries that unsettled me. Some of the patients had wounds that no one spoke of openly. Faces hollowed by despair, eyes glazed with memories too painful to share, fingers trembling without cause. The senior nurse pulled me aside once, her voice low. "Watch carefully," she said. "Not all wounds bleed. Some of them live inside." I didn't fully understand what she meant at the time, but I would come to see that she was right. Emotional scars were as dangerous as any physical one, and sometimes harder to heal. The corridors themselves seemed to carry stories. Every door, every ward, every locked storage room whispered secrets. I noticed that certain rooms were avoided by most staff unless ordered. Doors kept closed as if by habit or perhaps by fear. Occasionally, I would catch glimpses of figures moving behind frosted glass. Patients or staff, I couldn't tell, which made my curiosity grow. There were unspoken rules about which doors a junior medic like me should never open, and the tension between curiosity and obedience gnawed at me throughout the night. Around 3 in the morning, I found myself alone in a smaller ward, tasked with checking on a few of the quieter patients. That's when I first truly understood the subtlety of war injuries, the way a body can survive bullets and shrapnel yet carry a pain deeper than any surgeon can cut away. One man, barely awake, whispered something unintelligible. I leaned closer, trying to catch his words, but he only shook his head and muttered again. It was a fragmented tale of fear, regret, and memories he couldn't escape, a personal battlefield far from the front lines. I also began to notice small rituals among the night staff. A nurse would gently adjust a blanket over a patient without waking him. A doctor would pause for a few seconds before making a difficult incision, taking a breath as if bracing against some invisible weight. Even the janitors, who moved silently along the corridors, seemed aware of the tension, careful not to disturb the fragile equilibrium of life and death that hung in the air. These were people hardened by war, yet still profoundly human, and I felt simultaneously inspired and overwhelmed by their quiet resilience. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought exhaustion was making me hear things. Quiet murmurs in empty halls, soft footsteps behind doors I knew were locked, or fleeting shadows that vanished before I could focus on them. Later, I realized that the hospital had its own hidden life, a rhythm that didn't belong to any one person. Stories traveled in silence, about patients no one was supposed to see, about treatments that weren't officially recorded, about mistakes and triumphs that never made it into the reports. The hospital was alive, a complex organism with secrets threaded through every brick and beam. By dawn, I was physically drained but strangely alert. The night had been a baptism into the reality of a military hospital. I had seen bravery and terror side by side, heard stories that would haunt me for years, and glimpsed a hidden world of rules, whispers, and secrets. And yet, despite the exhaustion and the fear, there was a strange sense of purpose, a realization that every action, every small decision, mattered more here than anywhere else I had ever been. Walking back to the small room they had given me, I realized I was only beginning to understand the hospital's world. Every night would bring new challenges, new stories, and new truths hidden behind closed doors. And as I lay down for a few hours of sleep, I couldn't shake the sense that the hospital itself was watching, waiting, and preparing to reveal even more of its mysteries to me. Thomas Keller, a young medic who had stepped into a world far larger, stranger, and more complex than I had ever imagined. It was during my 3rd week at the hospital that I first noticed the rooms that seemed deliberately hidden from ordinary view. I had been delivering supplies to the surgical wing when a senior nurse, whose face was lined with exhaustion and secrets, gave me a warning glance. "Some patients aren't meant to be seen by everyone," she murmured. At the time, I didn't fully grasp what she meant. I thought perhaps she was referring to the more critical cases, or maybe those whose injuries were too grotesque for young medics like me to witness. But soon, the truth revealed itself in ways I could never have imagined. The first clue came one evening, as I walked past a corridor that had always seemed empty. The door at the end was slightly ajar, a faint glow spilling into the hallway. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped closer, listening. Inside, I glimpsed a patient lying on a metal table, their body obscured by surgical sheets. The doctors were speaking in hushed tones, moving with precision and an almost reverent caution. Instruments I had never seen before were passed carefully, and I realized that this was not an ordinary surgery. Something secretive was taking place here, something that the hospital hierarchy wanted to shield from prying eyes. Wordless fear and fascination intertwined in my chest. I retreated quickly before anyone noticed me, my mind spinning. Back in the main ward, I overheard nurses exchanging brief, coded conversations, mentions of special cases, confidentiality, and orders that were never to be questioned. Over the next few days, I began piecing together the unspoken truth. Certain patients were hidden from the majority of the staff, their conditions shrouded in secrecy. I wondered who they were, why they were being kept apart, and what had happened to bring them here. Some nights, when the wards were quieter and I could walk without interruption, I observed these secret patients from a distance. They weren't always physically unusual. Sometimes they were ordinary soldiers with ordinary wounds, but there was an air of something else, an intensity in the way the staff treated them, a carefulness that bordered on ritual. One patient, in particular, caught my attention. He was brought in on a stretcher wrapped in blankets, his face hidden, but the surgeon's hands trembled ever so slightly as they worked. The whispers among the nurses were quick, urgent, and full of fear. Even the most hardened medics seemed unsettled when this man was mentioned. I soon learned that some of these secretive cases involved psychological injuries so severe that they could not be documented openly. Others were victims of classified operations, soldiers whose experiences were considered too sensitive for the regular medical record. Sometimes it wasn't the injuries themselves that were strange, but the very procedures performed, medical techniques that were experimental, controversial, or otherwise hidden from the general staff. Observing from the shadows, I realized that these hidden patients were not just bodies to be healed. They were puzzles, their treatment a balance between science, secrecy, and moral ambiguity. The hospital had its own ecosystem of rules that no manual could teach. Staff members knew who could enter certain wards and who could not. A glance, a gesture, a nod could convey warnings as effectively as any written order. Rumors flowed in parallel to official instructions, whispers about forbidden experiments, strange recoveries, or patients who were never supposed to survive but did. Some stories were likely exaggerated, some entirely true, and others impossible to categorize. I had to learn which details were safe to acknowledge and which were dangerous to even think about aloud. One night, I caught a glimpse of the officers' private discussions. Behind a closed door, they spoke in low voices about patient transfers, sensitive cases, and orders that seemed detached from the medical reality of the hospital. These conversations hinted at motives far beyond the usual care of wounded soldiers. There were mentions of intelligence, clandestine research, and outcomes that had nothing to do with healing. The more I listened, the more I understood that the hospital was not merely a place for recovery. It was a strategic center, a hidden theater of influence, where the health of a soldier was only one variable among many. Even among the regular staff, a complex web of loyalty and discretion existed. Some nurses risked reprimand to care for patients who were otherwise ignored. Junior medics like me were taught early that questions could be dangerous, that curiosity must be tempered with caution. And yet, I couldn't suppress the urge to understand. Every secret I uncovered revealed another layer of the hospital's hidden life, another story that demanded attention, another puzzle that left me sleepless. The atmosphere grew heavier as the weeks passed. I began noticing patterns, certain patients arriving at odd hours, medical records altered subtly, and the silence of some wards that was almost deafening. There was a rhythm to these secrets, an almost imperceptible pulse that dictated when doors would open, when nurses would move, and when the officers would speak. It was as if the hospital had a consciousness of its own, watching, judging, and managing itself independently of the people within it. By the end of that third week, I had begun to understand a profound truth. A military hospital during wartime was a labyrinth of human experience, where healing, secrecy, morality, and fear coexisted in fragile equilibrium. The visible wounds were only part of the story. Behind the locked doors, in the hushed whispers and hidden cases, a different war was being fought. A war of ethics, survival, and untold human resilience. And I, Thomas Keller, was now fully entangled in it, a witness to secrets that would shape not just my understanding of medicine, but of humanity itself. By the time I reached my 4th week in the hospital, I began to notice something I hadn't expected: the tension between the doctors. On the surface, everyone appeared calm, composed, professional. But beneath that calm, there was an undercurrent of conflict. Arguments that were never spoken aloud, decisions that weighed heavily on each of them, and moral lines that were constantly being crossed and redrawn. I realized quickly that being a medic wasn't just about bandages and injections. It was about navigating a labyrinth of human conscience, authority, and survival, all while the war raged outside the walls. One afternoon, I was assigned to assist in a case that had everyone on edge. The patient was a young soldier, barely older than me, who had been brought in after a particularly brutal engagement. His injuries were severe, but the debate among the doctors was not about his wounds. It was about whether he should receive an experimental treatment, something that was technically allowed but morally questionable. One of the senior surgeons insisted it was necessary, that the procedure could save his life. Another hesitated, speaking in hushed tones about the risks, about precedent, about the ethical implications. And I, wide-eyed and inexperienced, was caught in the middle, unsure of where my duty truly lay. The moral tension in that room was palpable. I could feel it pressing down on me as if the air itself had thickened. The older surgeon's eyes were sharp and calculating, while the others were tired and hesitant, haunted by past mistakes. I watched as they weighed the potential benefit against the potential harm, their voices low, deliberate, each word a careful negotiation with conscience. For the first time, I realized that medicine in war was rarely about absolutes. It was about choices, compromises, and the unspoken acknowledgement that every action carried consequences, some of which could never be undone. It was during moments like this that the whispers among the staff became most revealing. Nurses would exchange glances, passing along information about past cases that had gone wrong, or patients whose conditions had been hidden to protect reputations or secrets. One nurse confided in me that some of these experimental treatments were performed on patients who had been brought in under mysterious circumstances, their true identities or histories known only to a select few. The term invisible patient began circulating quietly among the junior staff, a label for those who existed in the hospital's records, yet somehow remained unseen in the official sense. I remember watching one particular surgery, my hands shaking slightly as I held instruments for the senior surgeon. The patient's injuries were not extraordinary, but the way the procedure was carried out, silent, precise, almost ritualistic, made it clear that this was more than a medical intervention. It was a statement, a negotiation with fate, a confrontation with the boundaries of what was considered ethical. The surgeon's eyes flicked toward me briefly, perhaps to gauge my understanding, and I realized that in that instant, I was being trained not just in medicine, but in the subtleties of moral judgment in a place where rules were fluid and human life was both precious and expendable. Over the next few days, I began noticing patterns in the way conflicts played out. Certain doctors would avoid others, silently competing over who could make the right choice, who could bend the rules without breaking them, who could save a life without violating the unseen code of the hospital. Patients were often the silent witnesses to these moral battles, their bodies the canvas upon which decisions, debates, and compromises were enacted. And yet, Amid all this conflict, there were moments of profound care, small acts of kindness, whispered reassurances, a gentle hand on a shoulder, proof that humanity persisted even in the most trying circumstances. What struck me most was the duality of the environment. On one hand, there was the clinical, procedural side, charts, instruments, protocols. On the other hand, there was the undercurrent of moral tension, secretive experimentation, and personal judgment that shaped every decision. The two existed side by side, often in contradiction, and I found myself constantly questioning what was right, what was necessary, and what was simply a reflection of human frailty under pressure. Late one night, after a particularly grueling shift, I sat alone in the small break room, reflecting on what I had witnessed. The older surgeon, the one who had insisted on experimental treatments, passed by and offered me a quiet, almost cryptic piece of advice. "You will learn, Thomas, that in this hospital and in this war, the rules are not always written. Sometimes the right choice is the one no one will record." His words lingered in my mind, a reminder that the line between duty and morality was often invisible, blurred by necessity, fear, and the relentless march of war. By the end of that week, I understood that these moral conflicts were not anomalies. They were the heartbeat of the hospital. Every day, every shift, every patient became a test, a negotiation, a reminder that the human spirit, even in the face of unimaginable suffering, carried both light and shadow. And I, Thomas Keller, a young medic standing at the crossroads of life, death, and moral ambiguity, was only beginning to understand the full scope of what it meant to serve in this hidden, complex world behind the battle lines. Night shifts quickly became the most intense, the hours when the hospital seemed to reveal its true nature. By now, I had learned that the daytime calm, the steady clatter of carts, the soft chatter of nurses, the routine procedures, was only a surface layer. At night, the corridors seemed to breathe, as though the walls themselves remembered every scream, every whispered secret, every life saved and lost. The air was thick, carrying the weight of unseen stories, and I found myself constantly listening, watching, sensing the faint pulse of tension that never fully dissipated. My first night alone in one of the smaller wards was unforgettable. The hum of the lamps overhead mingled with distant cries and the occasional shuffle of footsteps. Patients who had been quiet during the day now stirred, some murmuring, some calling out, some staring into corners that seemed to hold shadows only they could see. It was a surreal kind of theater, where each individual performance was simultaneously real and intensely private. I moved quietly, checking for lines, adjusting blankets, offering brief words of comfort when I could, all the while aware that the hospital itself seemed to be alive, observing, almost judging. It was during one of these quiet hours that I first began to hear the whispers. At first, I dismissed them as the product of fatigue, my imagination playing tricks after too many sleepless nights. But over time, I realized they were real, though subtle. Faint conversations seemed to drift from closed rooms, fragments of words that hinted at patients who were never mentioned openly, treatments that skirted official protocols, and incidents that had been deliberately erased from the records. I tried to catch the meaning, piecing together bits of dialogue, but the deeper I listened, the more elusive the truth became. The hospital had layers, and each layer carried its own secrets, its own hidden life. One night, a nurse confided in me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some of them," she said, glancing toward a locked ward, "aren't really here to heal. They're here for other reasons. You'll see soon enough." I didn't know whether to be alarmed or intrigued. The words lingered in my mind, echoing long after she had gone. Who were these patients? What exactly were these other reasons? I felt a shiver run down my spine, a mixture of fear and anticipation that propelled me deeper into the hospital's mysteries. The strange noises were equally unsettling. From the distant clang of metal to the faint squeak of boots where no one should be, the sounds were a constant reminder that the hospital never truly slept. I remember pausing outside the operating theater one night, convinced I heard voices discussing something secretive. I pressed my ear against the door, but it fell silent, leaving only the faint drip of a leaky pipe. Sleep-deprived and tense, I began to sense that the hospital had a rhythm of its own, a pulse independent of the people inside it, and that rhythm was tied to secrets and stories far too complex to be cataloged in any chart or report. During these hours, I began to notice unusual patterns among the staff. Some nurses moved with almost ritualistic precision, performing small gestures that seemed intended to shield certain patients from observation. Doctors occasionally paused in hallways, exchanging glances or nods that carried weight far beyond casual acknowledgement. Even the cleaning staff had their own quiet routines, carefully avoiding certain rooms at specific times. I realized that everyone in the hospital was part of an unspoken network, a web of knowledge and discretion that ensured the most sensitive aspects of the hospital's work remained hidden. One incident in particular stayed with me. A patient who had been stable during the day suddenly began convulsing in the middle of the night. The doctors and nurses who responded moved with a blend of urgency and secrecy, communicating almost entirely through gestures and minimal words. No one outside that small circle was meant to see what was happening. I assisted where I could, my hands trembling, realizing that even in moments of crisis, the hospital's hidden protocols governed every action. It was as if chaos and order existed simultaneously, layered atop one another, and understanding one without acknowledging the other was impossible. I also began noticing how rumors spread during these shifts. Stories about patients who had arrived under mysterious circumstances, about treatments that seemed impossible, about recoveries and deaths that didn't appear in official logs, circulated in whispered chains. Some were exaggerated, some almost certainly true, and some deliberately fabricated to maintain morale or distract from more troubling truths. The ambiguity fascinated me. In the dead of night, I realized that the hospital was as much a repository of human psychology, fear, and superstition as it was a place of healing. By the end of those first few night shifts, I was profoundly changed. The hospital had revealed a layer of itself that was invisible in daylight, a hidden world of fear, courage, secrecy, and moral complexity. I had seen glimpses of what it meant to balance life and death, right and wrong, in an environment where every choice had consequences that could ripple far beyond the wards. And as I trudged back to my quarters, exhausted and uneasy, I understood that the nights would continue to teach me lessons no manual ever could, and that the deeper I went into this hidden world, the more I would encounter stories and secrets I was never prepared to fully comprehend. As the weeks passed, I began to understand that the hospital was not merely a place for treating visible wounds. It was a repository for invisible ones, scars that could not be sewn or bandaged. During my night rounds, I started noticing patients whose faces carried a weight far beyond what their injuries suggested. Some stared at walls as though they were seeing something no one else could. Others whispered to themselves or murmured half-formed stories that stopped abruptly when anyone approached. These were men and women broken by experiences that had nothing to do with physical trauma. And I, Thomas Keller, was learning how to navigate the delicate balance between tending to bodies and witnessing minds unraveling. One man, whom the staff referred to quietly as Private Sinclair, became a focus of my attention. He had been brought in after a particularly devastating battle, yet outwardly, his wounds were minor, a scraped arm, a few shallow cuts. But his eyes told a different story. Every time I approached him to check vitals or adjust his blanket, he would recoil slightly, as if the world itself were a threat. He whispered fragments of his past, explosions that had shaken him awake at night, friends lost to gunfire, moments of fear that had etched themselves into memory with brutal clarity. I listened as best I could, learning that sometimes the most critical medicine was simply presence, the quiet act of witnessing without judgment. Across the hall, another patient, a young nurse named Clara, had been transferred from the front lines after a traumatic incident. Her body was largely unharmed, yet she carried a tension so profound that it seemed to radiate through the ward. She wouldn't speak at first, her silence a protective barrier against the horrors she had witnessed. Gradually, however, small gestures, holding a cup, arranging her bedding, became a language of survival. I observed her interactions with the staff, noting how even the smallest kindness could become an anchor in a sea of chaos. These subtleties, I realized, were as vital as the most precise surgical intervention. The hospital was full of such hidden stories. A soldier who could no longer speak coherently, but whose fingers traced patterns on the bed sheet as though composing letters that could not be vocalized. A medic who flinched at sudden noises, haunted by memories that refused to be silenced. And then there were those who tried to mask their suffering behind humor, bravado, or silence, only to collapse in moments of privacy. I learned that understanding a patient often required seeing beyond the charts, beyond the treatments, into the fragile and intricate layers of human experience. I also discovered that these hidden stories were shared selectively among the staff. Senior nurses would exchange quiet details, passing along crucial insights about how best to approach certain patients, what triggers to avoid, and which interventions would not only heal the body but protect the fragile mind. The hospital functioned as a living network of knowledge, yet much of it was encoded in gestures, glances, and whispers. A misstep could exacerbate suffering, or worse, expose secrets that were never meant to be known. One night, I encountered a patient who refused to leave his bed. He had been wounded in ways that were not immediately life-threatening, but he was consumed by guilt for surviving when his comrades had not. He told me fragmented stories of battles that were never recorded officially, of moments when he had frozen, acted, or failed, each memory a weight that anchored him to despair. Sitting with him in silence, I realized that the role of a medic extended beyond physical care. It required empathy, patience, and a willingness to confront the raw, unfiltered human experience of war. The hospital, I understood, was as much a sanctuary for psychological wounds as it was for physical ones. As I moved through the wards, I also became aware of how the architecture of the hospital itself shaped these experiences. The high ceilings, long corridors, and heavy doors created spaces that amplified both isolation and observation. Patients could be simultaneously watched and left alone, cared for and ignored, safe yet vulnerable. This duality permeated the atmosphere, and I found myself constantly negotiating my presence, learning when to intervene and when to step back. Each patient required an approach tailored not only to their injuries, but to their history, fears, and unspoken narratives. By the end of these weeks, the lessons were clear. Healing in a military hospital during wartime was not merely a matter of knowledge or skill. It was an art of perception, of understanding the invisible battles that raged within each patient. And as I, Thomas Keller, walked those corridors, witnessing both triumph and despair, I came to realize that the true work of the hospital existed in these intimate, fragile spaces where human vulnerability and resilience met. Each story I encountered added a layer to my understanding of what it meant to care for others amidst the chaos of war, and each story, in its own way, whispered secrets I would carry long after the hospital faded from view. It was during my 7th week at the hospital that I truly began to confront the complexity of moral decisions in a place designed to heal, yet entangled in secrecy and war politics. The staff had grown accustomed to my presence, and I was beginning to see patterns that were invisible to outsiders. The ways certain patients were prioritized, certain treatments debated behind closed doors, and the way authority often clashed with conscience. On that week, I witnessed my first major ethical dilemma unfold, one that would leave a lasting impression on me. Thomas Keller, a young medic barely old enough to understand the weight of life and death. The incident began in the early morning hours, when a transport truck delivered a new group of patients. Among them was a soldier who had been severely injured. His chest partially collapsed and his breathing shallow and uneven. The attending surgeon, Dr. Weber, argued for an immediate experimental procedure that had never been attempted under these conditions. Another senior doctor, Dr. Lang, hesitated, questioning both the legality and the morality of the operation. Their disagreement was intense but quiet, the tension vibrating through the room like an electric current. I watched, frozen between eagerness to assist and fear of being complicit in something that might cross lines I wasn't yet ready to understand. The argument escalated into a careful negotiation of risk, ethics, and practicality. Dr. Weber insisted that the procedure could save the soldier's life and potentially offer data that would benefit countless others. Dr. Lang countered that the patient's consent was ambiguous, and that the potential harm could outweigh any theoretical benefits. I realized, for the first time, that a hospital in wartime was not a neutral place. Every decision carried implications far beyond the immediate care of the patient. It could influence research, military strategy, and even political considerations. The patient's body became a battleground, and the doctors were warriors in a conflict of conscience rather than bullets. As the debate continued, whispers spread among the nurses. Some were quietly supportive of Dr. Weber's plan, believing that extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary measures. Others sided with Dr. Lang, concerned about the slippery slope of experimentation and the erosion of medical ethics. I noticed glances exchanged between staff, subtle gestures that conveyed alliances and caution. It was a microcosm of the broader war outside, a reflection of tension, fear, and competing ideals condensed into a single operating theater. Eventually, the decision was made to proceed, but with compromises that reflected the moral tightrope the staff walked every day. The surgery was performed with extreme care, but I observed the subtle hesitation in the hands of the surgeon, the almost imperceptible pause before each incision, and the careful monitoring of every vital sign with a heightened awareness that the line between success and catastrophe was razor-thin. I assisted where I could, my hands steady but my mind racing, aware that I was witnessing history in a form that would never appear in reports or textbooks. The aftermath of the surgery revealed another layer of complexity. The patient survived, but complications arose that required constant attention. Some staff expressed relief, while others were visibly shaken by how close the outcome had come to disaster. The discussion of what had been done, what risks had been justified and which had overstepped ethical bounds, continued quietly in hallways and empty wards long after the patient had been stabilized. I realized that in this hospital, every action, no matter how minor it seemed, carried consequences that were moral, professional, and deeply personal. It was during these moments that I began to notice patterns in how staff approached these dilemmas. Experienced nurses often acted as mediators, gently guiding decisions and offering insight from both medical and ethical perspectives. Senior doctors weighed not just physical outcomes but the potential implications of each action, considering how it would reflect on the hospital, the army, and the broader medical community. And I, a junior medic, learned to observe, to listen, and to understand that competence in this environment required more than technical skill. It required moral acuity, patience, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. This week marked a turning point in my understanding of the hospital. I realized that the real battle was not only fought on the front lines, nor solely within operating rooms, but in the quiet, moral struggles of those entrusted with life and death. Each patient was more than a chart or a procedure. They were a test of conscience, a reflection of humanity under pressure. And as I walked the corridors that night, surrounded by whispers, shadows, and the faint hum of medical machines, I understood that my role as a medic went far beyond tending wounds. I was now a witness to the hidden moral wars that raged alongside the physical ones, and I would carry the lessons of that week with me for the rest of my life. By the 8th week, I began noticing incidents that could not be fully explained by medicine or logic. Patients would sometimes behave in ways that defied expectation, reacting to invisible stimuli or recalling events that made no chronological sense. One evening, I entered a ward where a soldier, previously stable, was staring blankly at a corner, his lips moving as if he were speaking to someone I could not see. When I asked him gently what he was saying, he merely shook his head and whispered about voices he had never mentioned before. The nurses exchanged cautious glances but said nothing. I realized then that the hospital had its own hidden layers, realities overlapping with the tangible world in ways that remained undocumented and secret. It wasn't just the patients. Staff occasionally reported equipment malfunctioning, lights flickering, or unexplained sounds. Footsteps in empty corridors, doors creaking shut by themselves, or whispers in languages no one could identify. Initially, I tried to rationalize these occurrences. Fatigue, stress, and the shadows of war playing tricks on minds already strained by endless nights. But over time, I began to accept that some things could not be neatly explained. The hospital seemed alive in ways that went beyond human understanding, a complex organism where reality itself sometimes bent to the weight of history, trauma, and secrecy. One night, while checking the vitals of a patient recovering from a chest wound, I saw the shadow of a figure moving across the wall. Yet when I looked, the corridor was empty. The moment was fleeting, almost imperceptible, yet it left a chill I could not shake. Later, the same patient murmured stories of a silent visitor who appeared only at night, offering comfort in ways the staff could not. The nurses dismissed it gently as a coping mechanism, but I sensed that these incidents, whether imagined or real, were intertwined with the hospital's essence. A mixture of trauma, hope, and the unseen threads connecting the living and the memories of those who had passed. In another ward, a soldier who had been through intense bombardments began speaking of places he had never been, of sounds that did not exist, and of people who had no record anywhere. The doctors were perplexed, debating whether these were signs of psychological distress or something more elusive. I observed in silence, realizing that the hospital was a crucible where human perception collided with the unknown, and that my role as a medic required both medical skill and a willingness to confront phenomena that defied explanation. During these weeks, I also began noticing subtle patterns in patient behavior. Some would become agitated at specific times, while others would fall into deep, unresponsive states. Certain rooms seemed to affect patients differently, with one ward fostering calm while another provoked anxiety. Staff moved cautiously, aware of the unspoken influences of environment, routine, and perhaps something beyond the physical. It became clear that healing was not simply about treating wounds. It was about understanding the intricate and sometimes inexplicable interplay of mind, body, and place. The senior nurses shared cryptic warnings about unstable energies, referring to areas where patients and staff had experienced unusual occurrences. While I was initially skeptical, the frequency of these events became impossible to ignore. Machines would fail only in certain rooms, patients would cry out at the same hour each night, and whispers, whether imagined or real, carried messages that seemed tailored for those who listened carefully. The hospital, I realized, was not a static entity. It had a rhythm, a consciousness shaped by decades of suffering, fear, and the relentless passage of human experience. By the end of the week, I was both exhausted and fascinated. The hospital had revealed layers of reality I could neither categorize nor fully understand. Its patients carried hidden narratives, its staff navigated moral mazes, and the environment itself seemed charged with stories that had no official place in any record. As I prepared to leave for a brief rest, I could not shake the feeling that I was now part of something much larger than any individual case. A living, breathing institution where the lines between the visible, the moral, and the mysterious were constantly shifting. I knew then that my time in the hospital would continue to challenge my understanding of medicine, morality, and reality itself. Each patient, each night, each shadowed corridor offered lessons that no textbook could teach. And as Thomas Keller, a young medic navigating this strange and intricate world, I felt both privileged and terrified to witness the hidden truths that lingered behind the wards, whispered by those who had seen too much and understood too little to fully explain. As the 9th week unfolded, the hospital revealed even more of its hidden dimensions. The mysterious occurrences I had witnessed in previous nights became more pronounced, almost routine, yet never losing their unsettling edge. It seemed that each patient carried a thread of the inexplicable, a story that could not be cataloged or explained, and the staff had developed a fragile equilibrium to accommodate it. I, Thomas Keller, was still learning how to navigate this delicate balance, but the longer I stayed, the more I realized that ordinary medicine was only a fraction of the truth here. One evening, I entered the psychiatric ward to check on a soldier whose identity had been partially concealed from the staff. He had been transferred after surviving a bombing that had left his unit decimated, and he spoke in fragmented sentences, often jumping between timelines. The nurses had grown used to his erratic speech, but I noticed that he often referenced individuals I had never seen, events that had no place in the hospital's official history, and locations that didn't exist on any map. When I asked gently about these visions, he leaned closer, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and urgency, and whispered, "They come when the lights go down. They tell me things I shouldn't know." I froze, realizing that he was speaking of something beyond psychological trauma, a perception of events that existed outside the boundaries of reality as I understood it. Not all cases were as abstract. A young medic, barely older than I, reported a patient who would suddenly scream at night, then fall silent, leaving no trace of distress on monitors or vitals. The staff had begun calling these incidents echo nights, a term that reflected their perplexity. Attempts to document or rationalize the events failed. The patient's body would remain calm, yet the psychological disturbance was unmistakable. I accompanied the nurse during one of these episodes and witnessed a chilling scene. The soldier sat upright, eyes fixed on an empty corner, trembling slightly, muttering words that seemed almost like incantations. The room was otherwise silent, yet the intensity of his fear filled every corner. No one intervened except to provide comfort, acknowledging silently that the source of the disturbance was beyond human comprehension. Other nights brought subtler anomalies. Equipment would behave unpredictably. Monitors flickered, for pumps paused without explanation, and doors would slowly creak open even when securely latched. At first, staff joked about the haunted wing, but over time, even humor lost its edge. Patterns emerged. Certain rooms, certain beds, certain patients were consistently affected by events that defied logic. The hospital was no longer just a building. It was an entity with moods, preferences, and perhaps memory. I began to sense that its very walls held the residue of every life, every fear, every secret that had passed through its halls. Among the most unsettling experiences were the silent visitors. Patients would sometimes reference figures that appeared only at night, shadowed presences that offered comfort or issued warnings. No staff member could verify these occurrences, and most approached the subject cautiously, offering explanations rooted in stress or exhaustion. but I began keeping notes in secret, trying to track patterns. Some visitors seemed protective, appearing to patients in distress. Others seemed indifferent or even menacing. The duality mirrored the moral complexities I had witnessed among the doctors. The hospital itself appeared to operate on a spectrum of care and indifference, its presence both nurturing and demanding. It was also during this week that I became aware of the subtle ways these experiences affected staff. Nurses whispered in corridors about doors opening on their own or hearing faint voices. Doctors occasionally left shifts early, claiming fatigue but returning days later with a haunted expression. Even cleaning staff, whose duties were considered mechanical and mundane, spoke of watchful eyes that seemed to follow them through empty halls. The hospital's influence was pervasive, and I began to understand that everyone, patient or staff, was subject to its hidden currents. One night, I approached Private Sinclair, who had first introduced me to the concept of hidden mental scars. He spoke of shadows that moved independently of light, of voices that offered guidance and criticism, and of memories that were not entirely his own. I listened, careful not to judge or dismiss. For the first time, I understood that the hospital's unseen life was intimately tied to those who inhabited it. Healing here required more than stitches or medication. It required navigation of a space where reality, perception, and human vulnerability intertwined in ways both delicate and dangerous. By the end of that week, my role had evolved. I was no longer merely a medic observing from the periphery. I was a participant in the hospital's intricate network of human experience, moral conflict, and inexplicable phenomena. Each night revealed new secrets, new challenges, and new insights into the delicate architecture of the mind and spirit under pressure. And as Thomas Keller, I realized that the hospital was not simply a place of healing. It was a living archive of human endurance, fear, and mystery, a world where the ordinary rules of medicine, time, and reality were constantly questioned and reshaped. By the 10th week, the hospital's hidden layers were beginning to feel less like anomalies and more like an integral part of daily life. The lines between routine care, moral dilemmas, and inexplicable phenomena had blurred, and I, Thomas Keller, was no longer merely observing. I was participating in a delicate, often uncomfortable balance. That week, I encountered the first truly dramatic incident that left an indelible mark on my understanding of what it meant to serve in this place. It began with the arrival of a group of soldiers whose injuries were severe but inconsistent with the stories given. One of them, Private Lawson, had a leg wound that was described as minor in the official report, yet his gait suggested a more serious trauma. When I attempted to examine him, he flinched violently at the slightest touch, his eyes darting nervously around the room as if anticipating something invisible. The attending physician, Dr. Weber, had insisted on an aggressive treatment plan, while Dr. Lang hesitated, worried about potential complications from an experimental procedure. I recognized immediately that this was not just a medical problem. It was a moral, psychological, and almost metaphysical challenge, all layered together in the confines of a single hospital ward. During the preparation for the procedure, unusual things began to happen. Monitors flickered inexplicably. The surgical instruments seemed to resist placement as if affected by an unseen force, and the room temperature fluctuated subtly but noticeably. The staff exchanged nervous glances, moving cautiously and quietly, aware that any disruption could escalate the tension further. I assisted where I could, my hands steady, but my mind racing with questions about what was real, what was perception, and what was the subtle influence of the hospital itself. There was a sense that the building was alive in some way, guiding, observing, or perhaps judging the actions of those within it. The procedure was carried out successfully, but its aftermath revealed deeper complications. Private Lawson exhibited behaviors that were alarming. Periods of extreme agitation followed by total withdrawal, muttering in languages no one recognized, and sudden outbursts that left even seasoned nurses unsure how to respond. The staff, already familiar with the hospital's unusual tendencies, treated these episodes with a combination of medical intervention, psychological support, and quiet acknowledgement of the unknown. I began to understand that survival here required flexibility, not only of body and mind, but of perception itself. Healing was never straightforward. It was an intricate dance among the patient, the staff, and the unseen influences that permeated the hospital. Another incident occurred the following night. A nurse reported seeing a shadow move independently along a hallway, pausing outside patient rooms before vanishing. The patients in these rooms often experienced sudden bouts of vivid hallucinations or emotional outbursts. Some dismissed it as fatigue or stress, yet patterns emerged too frequently to be ignored. I started to document these occurrences in secret, noting times, locations, and patient reactions. The hospital seemed to be communicating in a language beyond words, and I was beginning to decipher fragments of it, aware that the implications extended far beyond medical treatment. During these weeks, I also witnessed the personal toll on staff. Dr. Weber, whose insistence on experimental procedures often sparked moral debates, appeared increasingly haunted. Lines of worry etched his face, and he sometimes spoke to patients or nurses in a tone that suggested he was grappling with unseen pressures, or perhaps guilt. Dr. Lang, more cautious and contemplative, seemed burdened by the constant negotiation between ethics and necessity, occasionally retreating to quiet corners to gather composure. Nurses, too, carried their invisible loads, memories of failures, patient deaths, and moments of helplessness that could not be shared openly. The hospital was not merely shaping the patients. It was shaping everyone within its walls. By the end of that week, the reality was unavoidable. The hospital was a living ecosystem of human endurance, moral struggle, and the inexplicable. Patients' physical and psychological states intertwined with phenomena that could not be easily categorized. Staff had to navigate not only medical challenges but also ethical dilemmas and subtle, sometimes supernatural, occurrences that tested their perception and judgment. And I, Thomas Keller, a young medic caught in the current of this extraordinary environment, was learning to survive and adapt, understanding that the lessons of this place extended far beyond the boundaries of medicine, into the very essence of human experience under the pressure of war. By the 11th week, the hospital seemed to take on a life of its own, exerting subtle pressures on everyone inside. The cumulative weight of unspoken fears, moral compromises, and inexplicable phenomena began to manifest in ways that were difficult to ignore. Staff members moved with cautious precision, patients reacted unpredictably, and I, Thomas Keller, felt as though I had entered a place where time, morality, and reality itself were fluid, constantly shifting under the strain of war and secrecy. One evening, I was called to the pediatric ward, which had been largely neglected until then. A young boy, no more than 12, had been brought in after a bombing raid, physically unscathed but deeply traumatized. He refused to speak, yet he gestured frantically toward the corners of the room, pointing to shadows that no one else could see. The nurses exchanged uneasy glances, whispering about previous incidents in this ward that had been dismissed as hysteria or imagination. I knelt beside the boy, trying to establish contact, and realized that the hospital's hidden energies affected the most vulnerable with particular intensity. He wasn't imagining. They were present, lurking just beyond the edge of comprehension. Meanwhile, the effects of experimental procedures continued to emerge. Some patients who had survived the controversial surgeries experienced sudden changes in behavior. A soldier who had previously been composed now displayed bursts of aggression and erratic speech, while another began describing visions of past and future events with alarming clarity. The staff debated how to manage these outcomes. Were they the natural consequences of trauma, side effects of the procedures, or evidence of something far stranger at work? Every answer seemed insufficient, and the uncertainty hung over the wards like a persistent fog. During night rounds, I began noticing patterns in the hospital's behavior. Certain rooms appeared to amplify patients' fears, while others induced calm and clarity. Shadows moved in ways inconsistent with lighting, and faint whispers could be heard in hallways that should have been empty. Nurses, seasoned and unflappable in daylight, now exhibited subtle signs of unease, adjusting routines or avoiding specific areas. Even Dr. Weber and Dr. Lang, whose debates had once defined the moral landscape of the hospital, seemed affected, restless, distracted, and occasionally pale with apprehension after long shifts. The hospital was no longer merely a building or an institution. It was an active participant in the lives of those within it, shaping actions, thoughts, and perceptions in ways that could not be controlled. One night, I was called to a surgical suite where an emergency procedure was underway. A soldier had arrived with multiple shrapnel wounds, and the senior surgeon was forced to improvise. As the team worked, the equipment malfunctioned inexplicably. Monitors flickered, suction devices paused, and surgical lights dimmed momentarily. Despite the chaos, the procedure continued, but everyone involved felt the weight of an unseen presence. Afterwards, whispered conversations among the staff revealed mutual acknowledgement that the hospital itself had intervened, or at least had reminded them of its omnipresent influence. I began to accept that the building was not passive. It was an entity shaped by human suffering, moral decisions, and the accumulation of countless unseen experiences over years of war. Psychological crises became increasingly common. Private Sinclair, who had long struggled with trauma, began displaying symptoms of extreme disorientation. He would wander corridors at night, murmuring about conversations he had overheard from rooms that were empty, or recounting instructions given by figures no one else could see. Nurses attempted to calm him, using routines and medications, but the hospital seemed to resist containment. Even I, trained to remain objective and rational, felt a creeping unease, as if each unexplained event chipped away at my understanding of reality. Healing here was never straightforward. It required constant vigilance, empathy, and a willingness to confront the inexplicable. By the end of the week, the cumulative effects were undeniable. The hospital had become a crucible of human endurance, moral ambiguity, and phenomena that defied explanation. Patients' minds and bodies were intertwined with forces beyond conventional understanding, and staff navigated a delicate balance between intervention, observation, and survival. And I, Thomas Keller, was learning to adapt, to recognize patterns, and to maintain my sense of self in an environment that constantly challenged my perceptions, my ethics, and my understanding of what it truly meant to care for another human being under the shadow of war. By the 12th week, whispers began circulating among the staff, soft, cautious murmurs about patients who had vanished overnight. No official record existed of these disappearances. They were never logged in the charts, and inquiries were often brushed off with vague explanations about transfers or administrative errors. Yet those who worked the night shifts knew better. The hallways themselves seemed to confirm the rumors. Empty beds where someone had lain the night before, doors left ajar that were usually locked, and a subtle, almost imperceptible chill that lingered after each unexplained absence. I, Thomas Keller, was both alarmed and fascinated, aware that these events were a layer of the hospital's hidden reality that few dared confront directly. One case in particular haunted me. A young soldier, recently admitted after sustaining a concussion, was calm and responsive during the day. At night, however, he became agitated, staring at the shadows as if expecting someone or something to appear. By morning, his bed was empty, and no one could account for his whereabouts. The senior nurses whispered that it had happened before in similar circumstances, and that some patients were drawn into situations beyond human comprehension. I checked the corridors, the storage rooms, even the basement, but found no trace. The silence that followed was thick, almost tangible, and I began to feel the hospital not just as a place of healing, but as a complex ecosystem of secrets, fears, and invisible forces. Staff reactions to these vanishings were varied. Some became defensive, insisting that the patients had been moved for medical reasons or administrative purposes. Others were visibly shaken, quietly discussing patterns they could not publicly acknowledge. Dr. Weber appeared deeply unsettled, unusually quiet during rounds, while Dr. Lang seemed preoccupied, scribbling notes in his journal that he never shared. Even the seasoned nurses, usually composed and methodical, displayed subtle signs of anxiety, lingering too long at certain doors, pausing mid-step as if sensing unseen observers. It was clear that the hospital's hidden dynamics affected everyone, blurring the line between professional duty and personal vulnerability. The disappearances also impacted patient behavior. Some began to fear certain wards or rooms, refusing treatment or retreating to corners for safety. Others became hyper-aware, tracking staff movements and whispering about watchers or shadows. I observed these reactions carefully, realizing that the hospital's influence extended beyond the physical to the psychological, shaping perceptions, behaviors, and the delicate equilibrium of trust between patients and caregivers. Healing was no longer a simple transaction of care. It was an intricate negotiation with forces both visible and invisible, understood and mysterious. During one particularly long night, I found myself in the surgical preparation room, reviewing cases, when I noticed a faint light flickering at the end of the hallway. Curious, I walked toward it, only to find a patient sitting calmly on the floor, seemingly unaware of my approach. He whispered about voices that guided him, shadows that beckoned, and doors that opened only when no one else was looking. I realized then that these phenomena were not random. They were patterns, subtle interactions between the hospital and those within it, a hidden language that few could read and even fewer dared to interpret. Each incident, each disappearance, was part of a larger, unspoken narrative. By the end of the week, the hospital had solidified its reputation as a place where the extraordinary was ordinary, and where the unseen and the unexplained shaped the daily reality of both patients and staff. The moral, psychological, and supernatural dimensions intertwined in ways that left no clear boundary between what was real and what was perceived. And I, Thomas Keller, continued my work with cautious attention, aware that every decision, every movement, every glance might ripple through layers of reality I could only partially comprehend. The hospital was a living entity, its secrets layered, its lessons subtle, and its influence pervasive, guiding each night's events in ways that demanded respect, vigilance, and humility. By the 13th week, the pattern of disappearances had begun to influence not only patient behavior but also the dynamics among the staff. Night shifts became exercises in quiet observation, with nurses and doctors carefully noting any anomaly, subtle movements, or inexplicable sound. I, Thomas Keller, had grown accustomed to the eerie atmosphere, but even I felt the tension tighten around every corridor and ward. There was a sense that the hospital itself was aware of those who remained, measuring responses, testing resilience, and occasionally exerting influence over human decisions in ways that were impossible to predict. One night, I encountered a patient who had returned from an unexplained absence. Private Lawson, who had vanished for nearly 12 hours, appeared at the entrance of Ward C, silent, eyes wide and trembling. He did not speak at first, only pointing toward the shadows that lingered at the edges of vision. Slowly, he recounted being guided through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly, past rooms that no longer existed, and down staircases that appeared where no staircases should have been. He described voices offering both comfort and warning, hands that seemed to brush his arm without touching him, and glimpses of faces, sometimes familiar, sometimes unrecognizable, who watched but never spoke. I documented every word, realizing that the hospital's influence was expanding, intertwining with both physical and psychological realms in ways that defied comprehension. Staff reactions to these returns were mixed. Some were relieved to have the patient back, grateful that no physical harm had occurred. Others were wary, noting subtle changes in behavior, hesitation in speech, prolonged eye contact with empty spaces, and gestures that seemed directed at invisible companions. The senior nurses began a series of quiet meetings, debating how to support these patients while maintaining hospital order. Dr. Weber, whose confidence in experimental procedures had once been unwavering, now hesitated before each intervention, aware that unseen forces were now part of the equation. Even Dr. Lang, cautious by nature, voiced concerns that certain rooms and routines might be amplifying these occurrences, further entangling human and supernatural elements in a web that was difficult to untangle. It was during one of these nights that I witnessed an interaction that left me profoundly unsettled. A patient, recently returned from disappearance, began speaking directly to what he called the Watchers, addressing them as if they were present in the room. He asked questions, offered promises, and received responses only he could interpret. The nurses and I observed silently, understanding that intervention might disrupt a delicate balance. The hospital, in this moment, seemed to assert its authority, guiding actions, shaping behavior, and reminding all who were present that it was not merely a building but an active participant in the unfolding reality. I realized that to work here was to acknowledge a duality: the tangible and intangible, the seen and unseen, the ethical and the inexplicable. Meanwhile, ordinary medical challenges continued to unfold alongside these extraordinary events. Wounds needed tending, infections had to be monitored, and the endless rotations of night shifts demanded constant vigilance. The invisible pressures compounded the physical and emotional workload, creating fatigue that was both ordinary and extraordinary. Nurses whispered about fatigue that was more than exhaustion, an oppressive weight, as if the building itself exerted a subtle force on the body and mind. Doctors debated interventions not only based on medical knowledge but also on intuition, informed by patterns they could not fully articulate. By the end of that week, it was clear that the hospital had established a new equilibrium, one in which disappearances, returns, and unexplained phenomena were integral to its operation. Patients' experiences were layered with both trauma and insight, and staff had adapted to navigate a reality in which perception and morality were constantly tested. I, Thomas Keller, found myself both participant and observer, increasingly aware that every step, every decision, and every observation could ripple through a network of events far larger and more complex than any one individual could control. The hospital had become a living organism, shaping lives, influencing minds, and embedding secrets within its walls that would remain long after the war had ended. By the 14th week, the hospital's influence had begun to reach me directly. I, Thomas Keller, had spent months observing, documenting, and assisting, yet now the environment seemed to assert itself over my own perceptions. At first, it was subtle. Faint whispers in empty hallways, fleeting shadows at the corner of my vision, and the occasional sensation of being followed even when no one was present. I tried to rationalize these experiences, attributing them to fatigue, stress, or the oppressive weight of prolonged exposure to human suffering. Yet the intensity of these encounters grew, and I realized that the hospital did not merely affect patients. It affected everyone who moved through its corridors, weaving an invisible web of influence that was impossible to ignore. The first significant incident occurred during a routine night shift. I was checking vitals in the surgical ward when I noticed a subtle distortion in the room's lighting, almost as if the walls themselves were breathing. Instruments appeared to shift slightly when I wasn't looking directly, and a low hum, barely audible, seemed to emanate from the walls. I froze, heart racing, aware that my rational mind could offer no explanation. The other staff, experienced and composed, barely glanced at me, suggesting a tacit understanding that certain events were to be accepted rather than questioned. For the first time, I felt the hospital as an active presence, observing, interacting, and shaping reality itself. Soon after, I began experiencing dreams that were unusually vivid, often blurring the line between memory, imagination, and external influence. In these dreams, corridors stretched endlessly, wards merged into unfamiliar spaces, and patients I had treated whispered warnings or cryptic advice. I awoke each morning with the residue of these visions lingering, a sense that the hospital's reach extended even into my subconscious. The line between duty and perception blurred. I was no longer merely a witness, but an instrument in the hospital's unfolding narrative. One particularly striking encounter occurred in the isolation ward. A patient who had disappeared for 2 nights reappeared unexpectedly, sitting calmly on the floor, eyes closed, hands folded. When I approached, he opened his eyes and spoke in a voice that was both familiar and foreign. He described events in the hospital that had not occurred, or that had occurred in ways I could not verify. Nurses and doctors looked on quietly, acknowledging the truth of his words without explanation. I realized that my presence was part of the hospital's intricate interplay, and that the boundaries between observer and participant had dissolved entirely. Staff reactions to my experiences varied. Dr. Weber noticed subtle changes in my behavior, my increased caution, the slight tremor in my hands during certain procedures, the way I hesitated before entering specific wards. He offered quiet advice, reminding me to remain grounded in observation, ethics, and procedure. Dr. Lang, more contemplative, encouraged me to keep detailed notes, not merely of medical data, but of phenomena that seemed beyond conventional understanding. Nurses provided practical support, subtly guiding me through routines and wards where the hospital's influence was strongest, offering reassurance without dismissing my growing unease. By the end of the week, I understood that the hospital had claimed a new dimension of my attention and awareness. Patients, staff, and even I were all woven into its complex fabric, influenced by forces that were at once psychological, moral, and possibly supernatural. Healing, observation, and survival were no longer separate pursuits. They were interdependent threads in a vast, intricate network of life, ethics, and perception. The hospital had become more than a site of care. It was a living archive, a teacher, and a challenge, constantly testing resilience, morality, and comprehension. And I, Thomas Keller, could no longer see myself as merely a medic. I was now an active participant in a reality that expanded far beyond the conventional boundaries of medicine, morality, and human understanding. By the 15th week, the subtle influences of the hospital had escalated into direct interactions. I, Thomas Keller, could no longer separate routine duties from the unexplainable. One night, while checking the vitals of a patient recovering from severe burns, I felt an unmistakable presence at my shoulder. A pressure, not physical but perceptible, as if something or someone were observing me with intent. I glanced around, the corridor empty, the monitors silent. Yet the sensation persisted, a quiet insistence that I was not alone. The patient's eyes, normally half closed in sedation, fluttered open, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if he could see the presence too. He whispered, "It's watching us, Thomas. Always watching." The words, though soft, resonated with an authority that made my skin crawl. In subsequent nights, interactions became more pronounced. Patients who had disappeared and returned now seemed to possess knowledge or awareness that exceeded their physical condition. Private Lawson, whose experiences had been most vivid, began guiding others, cautioning them about the timing of certain occurrences, advising them how to navigate corridors, and even predicting shifts in the hospital's atmosphere. Staff, including myself, had to adapt rapidly. These instructions, though strange, often prevented escalation or panic. It became clear that the hospital had an intelligence, or at least a rhythm, and that those sensitive enough could perceive and respond to it. The surgical wards provided another layer of complexity. Equipment malfunctioned in ways that were more than coincidental. Lights dimmed precisely when tension in a procedure peaked, monitors fluctuated when vital signs were stable, and instruments would subtly shift position when unobserved. During one critical operation, I felt a faint tug at my sleeve, as though a guiding hand ensured my grip remained steady. I did not see anyone, yet the operation proceeded without incident, a strange collaboration between human skill and some hidden force. Afterwards, the attending surgeon nodded silently, a shared acknowledgement that what had occurred could not be explained by conventional medicine alone. Moral dilemmas intensified. Some patients, particularly those exposed to experimental procedures or prolonged trauma, began to display altered perceptions and behaviors that challenged ethical standards. Decisions about intervention were no longer purely medical. They were now intertwined with understanding unseen forces, interpreting the hospital's subtle guidance, and maintaining a fragile balance between care and autonomy. I found myself questioning every choice. Was I acting for the patient or responding to the hospital's influence? Were outcomes determined by skill, intuition, or the mysterious rhythms that had become a constant presence? Staff cohesion became critical. Dr. Weber, whose confidence had wavered in previous weeks, began convening discreet nightly discussions to share observations, debate responses, and strategize interventions. Dr. Lang documented phenomena in extensive notes, creating a secret record of patterns, timings, and interactions. Nurses coordinated carefully, observing patients for signs of abnormal influence and subtly guiding them through routines that mitigated distress. I participated actively, both learning and contributing, aware that every action, every glance, and every decision could have unforeseen consequences in a hospital that was simultaneously physical, psychological, and something else entirely. By the end of the week, the interplay between humans and the hospital had reached a new level. Patients were no longer passive recipients of care. They were active participants in a delicate dance with unseen forces. Staff had adapted to navigate moral, physical, and psychological challenges simultaneously. And I, Thomas Keller, increasingly understood that survival and healing here required not only medical skill but acute perception, adaptability, and humility in the face of phenomena that defied rational explanation. The hospital was no longer merely a location. It was a complex organism, alive with memory, influence, and a consciousness that demanded respect, attentiveness, and constant vigilance. By the 16th week, the tension within the hospital had reached a peak. The staff, while still functioning, now operated under an unspoken acknowledgement of forces beyond their comprehension. I, Thomas Keller, observed the subtle frictions that had developed, small disagreements over treatment plans, differing interpretations of patient behavior, and moral debates intensified by the hospital's inexplicable influence. These conflicts were rarely loud, yet they carried weight, leaving traces of unease in hallways and break rooms, ripples that affected both patients and staff alike. One night, an argument broke out between Dr. Weber and Dr. Lang over the treatment of a returning patient who had vanished for 3 nights. Dr. Weber insisted on aggressive intervention, believing that medical action could correct the unpredictable behaviors, while Dr. Lang advocated for observation, emphasizing patterns he had recorded of the hospital's influence and the potential consequences of disrupting them. Voices rose quietly, tension coiling like a living thing, until the patient, seemingly aware of the discord, whispered words that silenced the room. "You cannot fight what watches from the walls." It was a chilling reminder that the hospital's presence was active, perceptive, and that human authority was limited in comparison to its hidden reach. Patients, too, reacted to these escalating tensions. Those sensitive to the hospital's rhythms became restless, sometimes panicked, while others seemed to gain heightened awareness, anticipating shifts in the environment and guiding themselves and peers through the night. Private Sinclair, who had long struggled with hallucinations and disorientation, began organizing his fellow patients, advising them on how to avoid rooms where disturbances had been frequent and when to remain still to minimize agitation. The staff watched cautiously, acknowledging his insights silently, aware that cooperation with these insights often prevented crisis. In the surgical suites, equipment anomalies persisted and grew in subtle sophistication. Instruments would sometimes align perfectly for procedures before anyone touched them, while lights would dim or brighten according to the emotional tension of those present. I noticed that my own movements occasionally felt guided, as if a gentle hand ensured precision and stability during critical moments. The awareness that the hospital exerted this kind of influence added a layer of responsibility and unease to every task. Human skill, intuition, and unseen guidance were now inseparable, a partnership of necessity that demanded vigilance and humility. The moral landscape became increasingly complex. Decisions about medication, experimental procedures, and patient interaction were no longer straightforward. Choosing to intervene aggressively risked disrupting the subtle equilibrium of the hospital and endangering those sensitive to its rhythms. Inaction risked physical deterioration or psychological collapse. Staff debated quietly, balancing medical expertise, intuition, and the hospital's unseen influence. Each decision carried weight, shaping outcomes in ways that were tangible and intangible, immediate and long-term. By the end of the week, it was clear that the hospital had woven its influence into every aspect of life within its walls. Staff, patients, and I had adapted to navigate a reality in which human understanding was constantly tested, and in which perception, morality, and survival were intertwined in a delicate and often fragile network. I, Thomas Keller, recognized that to thrive here required not only competence and observation but trust in patterns and guidance that could not be fully articulated. The hospital was not a static institution. It was a living, responsive organism with memory, perception, and influence that extended beyond the visible, shaping all who dwelled within its corridors.